Thank you, Greta, and thanks everybody for being here. It's really fun to actually meet all the people I email and Zoom with, actually in person, see the back of your head. It's nice to be addressing Greta as Greta and not mistyping her name as Great and then fixing it to Greta, a Freudian slip perhaps. But yeah, this is fun to be in the real world with all of you. So thank you all today for your patience. I got some beer thirst, so I'll probably talk fast. But excited to talk to you a little bit about coexisting and rewilding with North America's carnivores. So I like to start every talk with the global view, a reminder of the place that we're all coming from. We share this world, this globe, and we live in the Anthropocene, the age dominated by humans. So we live in a hot, hungry, and crowded world. And so my approach to coexistence, Project Coyote's approach to coexistence, is to address these challenges in the Anthropocene with coexistence, and I'll talk a little bit more about how rewilding might be the next step. So Project Coyote takes a tripartite approach to promoting coexistence through education, science, and advocacy. So we advocate for good best practices in terms of federal, state, and local policies and practices. We work with ranchers on the ground to promote the best non-lethal tools that we can. We use science to inform all of our best management practices and policy. And then we do a lot of public education and outreach to nudge people towards good coexistence behaviors. So my career has been dedicated to answering this question. How do we move from conflict to coexistence? If you had asked me what my subdiscipline was when I was finishing a PhD in wolf management in Michigan, I would have said, I'm trying to understand human-wildlife conflict. And that's so much of the framing as we talk about coexistence is really about conflict. But I think that's a problem because it overstates risk in a lot of ways. There's not a whole lot of human-wildlife conflict really happening on the ground. We have, dreaded cases that stand out. Just like any sort of negative experience, when you watch the news, the negative things stand out. You remember those things because we're meant to learn and adapt to those negative experiences. But really, the risks from carnivores to humans are overstated in so many ways. So according to U.S. Department of Agriculture's own statistics, less than 1% of livestock losses come from large carnivores. There's so many other risks that get ignored. And so I think talking about conflict, we've got to recognize that most of the conflict is really human-human conflict over policies and practices around wildlife management. So if we're going to talk about coexistence, how we're moving towards this new goal, we've got to define what we're actually thinking about. So I turn to my friends in academia, Neil Carter and John Linnell, for their really great definition of coexistence, which is a dynamic but sustainable state in which humans and wildlife co-adapt to living in shared landscapes. I think every part of this definition is really important. And the definition goes on to include things like tolerable levels of risk and effective institutions. But what I want to focus on today is this part of the definition. It's dynamic, it's not static, and it's sustainable, hopefully in perpetuity, but it has to be adaptive. There's no one-size-fits-all panacea. These things have to change over time and based on the context, the local context. And it's co-adaptation. So that's something that we don't focus a whole lot on, is this two-way arrow where humans are adapting to the presence of wildlife and wildlife are adapting to the presence of humans, whether or not we realize it. For good reason, we focus on one side because at least theoretically we can nudge people and educate people, give them the tools to be able to adequately respond to the presence of wildlife. But wildlife are also responding to us. They become more nocturnal in some landscapes where they want to use the same places as humans. Some of that can be beneficial. Some of that might be maladaptive for the species. And we're not even asking all of those questions, but it is a consideration. I think grizzly bears are really interesting because based on age and sex, they will affiliate with humans more or less. So females, especially those with cubs, and subadult males will often affiliate closer to human residences because they're seeking protection from big adult male grizzlies that can be aggressive towards those age and sex classes. And adult male grizzlies avoid human habitation because they often get into trouble there. So really interesting co-adaptation that is happening as part of coexistence picture and needs to be considered. And then shared landscapes. I don't think we can take that assumption for granted. I think there's still a lot of folks in the conservation community that think about fortress conservation as the way to save large critters, that we have protected areas only for large terrestrial mammals. We put up fences and we keep a lot of separation. Now, obviously, as more and more people recognize it's a hot, hungry, and crowded world, that we've got to share our backyards, we've got to share our playgrounds on public lands, that we've got to think more about these shared landscapes. Another good definition that I think just complements and kind of summarizes the other definition really well comes from Project Coyote's executive director and founder, Camilla Fox, and some of our science advisors. And they define coexistence as a mutually beneficial living arrangement that meets the vital needs of humans and large carnivores. So I think a pretty complementary idea there. So the question then is, when you look at context on the ground, is this coexistence? You see domestic animals, you see people, they're present near their domestic animals, so they're probably range riding and doing some of the best practices that we promote for coexistence. And there's lots of things that can be done. So where domestic and wild animals co-occur, there's 4 different categories of coexistence tools that we often talk about. There's erection of barriers, the age-old tools of fences with modern updates like electrified solar panels to have e-fladry, electric fladry, which is also an ancient tool with a modern update. You can have light fencing that can be moved around very easily for rotational grazing. That's just one category. You can reduce attractants. So that's livestock husbandry practices like cleaning up afterbirth or carcasses. So you're not bringing in large carnivores closer to domestic animals. So carcasses are basically the gateway drug to depredations.
Are you using your
guardians, be it humans or other domestic animals like dogs, llamas, donkeys, another great tool. And then hazing or scaring devices is the 4th category. And I think probably Suzanne will discuss some of these in more detail. So sure, this is coexistence in some aspects of the definition. It's sharing spaces, but in some contexts, I would ask, are we asking the land to do too much, particularly in the face of drought, climate change, mass extinction, loving our public lands to death with a lot of outdoor recreation? We're asking these places to do a whole lot on top of being wildlife habitat and grazing. So what isn't coexistence? Well, the easy answer there is the status quo wildlife management that we see happening so much on public lands. Status quo wildlife management uses indiscriminate tools like traps that you see here, lethal snaring, poisoning, aerial gunning. This is happening under the guise of wildlife management, and it's not working. And we have best available modern science to show how it's not only not working, it may be very counterproductive. This is the status quo in a lot of places. This happens on private and public land. This is representative of wildlife killing contests, something that Project Coyote works quite a bit to try and stop. We've got 8 states that have banned this practice, and we've just got federal legislation introduced by Representative Cohen to ban the practice on federal public lands across the country, which would be huge. So this is again the status quo right now. This is what we're up against. We're up against the federal government. Sorry, these slides the formatting is a little wonky. They're getting cut off. But from 2011 to 2020, Wildlife Services, a rogue program under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has killed almost 700,000 wild animal lives lost to just their traps and snares. This is status quo wildlife management on our public and private lands. This is more stats on Wildlife Services. They're the ones going in prophylactically and mowing down coyotes from the air during lambing and calving seasons, again, to no effect other than potentially within 8 months increasing coyote populations through their compensation of anthropogenic mortality, and probably creating more of a problem, probably creating job security, essentially. They can go through this vicious cycle and always be needed when your measurement of success is a pile of dead coyotes, not reduce conflict. I would love to see some science in a place where coyotes are unexploited or wolves are unexploited, where we could see how low levels of conflict might actually be if we weren't going in and killing canids or mountain lions or bears and could see stable social population dynamics playing out, we might see a lot less conflict. So the antidote to the status quo and to the problem of trying to ask too much of our public lands, I argue, is rewilding. So if we rewild this hot, hungry, and crowded world and give a little bit more space to wildness, I think that will help quite a bit. So when I say rewilding, you're probably thinking about reintroductions of apex predators like wolves into Yellowstone, or you might be thinking about this, I think it was a viral video at some point where people realized that back in the 40s, the Forest Service dropped in parachuted beavers into a river system in Idaho to rewild that area. So if you've not seen this video, it's pretty interesting, check it out. But maybe you're thinking about those kind of reintroductions as synonymous with rewilding. And of course it is, but rewilding is actually a lot more. Rewilding is, comprehensive. It's large-scale conservation efforts, focused on restoring sustainable biodiversity and ecosystem health overall. So looking at the 3 C's, cores, corridors, and carnivores as a full system to restore wild and healthy ecosystem function. So the 3 C's are corridors, that core habitat of good wildlife habitat, or what could be really good habitat, the corridors in between those cores, and then of course carnivores or highly interactive species, keystone species like beavers that can help restore some of those natural systems like water cycles and such. So because there are a lot of other people way smarter than me on this, I like to include quotes from other folks. So rewilding, in essence, is giving the land back to wildlife and wildlife back to the land. And that's the Rewilding Institute's executive director, John Davis, who said that. And we work very closely with them in this work. So how do we go about doing this? First, we identify those cores, and we identify corridors in between there, and then we work to enact protections. And another key piece of this that something that Project Coyote is bringing to our rewilding work across North America is to bring in those coexistence education so that if we're asking landowners or public lands allottees to set aside some places, maybe marginal areas that are not great production. In the Mississippi watershed, we're talking to farmers about, those floodplains, those steep slopes that aren't doing any good for you anyway, that are low production. Leave those alone. Perhaps that can be incentivized through conservation reserve program dollars, that sort of thing. But we're identifying those places that might be marginal for production, but might, kind of enhance and get people who wouldn't necessarily think about rewilding or coexistence to start that process. And if we do those in priority areas where we've got, early innovators that are willing to try it and then spread that to their neighbors, who knows? This could be scaled up to a point where we could get good restoration. So you might ask, what about the farmers and ranchers? I include a picture of my great-grandfather who's a farmer in the Midwest. So that's just a reminder to say that, I'm a daughter of at least 3 generations of farmers. So I don't take talking about reforming agriculture very lightly. I understand the heritage. I understand the small farmer getting pushed out, and ranchers are seeing that. I see ranchers cut down their herds because of drought. I see how hard it is to have that livelihood, but I understand the tradition in the background. So I don't say this lightly, but we have to reform animal agriculture. We have protein alternatives. We have options that are going to disrupt the market. They're saying within 20 to 30 years, it's not going to make sense to grow meat on the hoof, so to speak. So the disruption is happening. So how can we meet these coexistence goals together? And that's where I think we look to mining communities and the just transition work that's happened, and look towards social justice movements to reach out and work with folks and say, hey, the kids in 4-H, the kids in Future Farmers of America, they don't see a place for taking over the family ranch because they realize climate change is going to put them out of business. So how do we help communities, rural communities, transition to sustainable livelihoods? That could be, depending on the place, growing food that will support a more plant-based diet. That could be well-planned ecotourism and outdoor rec to help sustain rural economies. It could be promoting, expanding some of these incentive-based federal programs. There's lots of potential ideas. People are starting to talk about it. We need to talk about it more. So, that's one of the things I would really love to get out of this conference is if you have ideas, let's talk about what we can do. And another thing that Project Coyote is working on is we've got a summit planned in 2023 where we're looking to bring together people, break down silos, bring people from all kinds of disciplines to talk about this really gnarly situation that we've got ourselves in. Big challenges of biodiversity and climate crises. And the center of that, along with carnivore conservation challenges, is to reform and end animal agriculture and move towards something more sustainable. So big ideas we want to talk about. If you are interested in learning more about that effort, come find me afterwards. And then I also just want to recognize, we promote the intrinsic value of wildlife. We have to recognize the intrinsic value of all life and think about, okay, what are we going to do about the cows? So they've been a pawn in this game. And how do we ethically depopulate public lands of cows? That's a good question. Where are they going to go? How are we going to manage that? I don't have any answers, but I feel it would be remiss not to mention that challenge. So again, here we are, back to the global view. We're in Salt Lake City. This is typically where I say what you can do to coexist, but I think you all know, and that's why you're here. So again, let's just keep talking, collaborating, thinking open-mindedly, and talk about how we can coexist and rewild. And with that, I will say thanks.